I think one of the most difficult emotions for us to manage right now as we walk through what we're walking through as a country is disappointment. Disappointment is often the result of unmet expectations. And right now, so many things in life are not going the way that we would have expected them to go. For Courtney and I, we're about to have our first baby, and that experience is not exactly what we would have thought it would have been because of the way the hospital is and all of that kind of stuff. And you've got stuff like that in your life too, I'm sure. Maybe some of you are still bummed that you didn't get to watch March Madness or you haven't gotten to see the Blues play in a while. Maybe for some of you, work, you had lots of plans or projects that you were anticipating working on this year, and all of that just looks a little bit different. Maybe with school, things look different, and you didn't know you were going to be saying bye to your teacher when you went to school in March at some point. And so school is going differently than you thought. Maybe just not being able to see friends and interact with people and go on coffee dates and get lunch with people. And maybe that is just different than you were thinking it would be, and that's disappointing. Maybe you've had a birthday or special occasion that you have celebrated in the midst of this, and it was still fun and y'all made do, but it wasn't like you would have hoped it would have been. Maybe the financial position that you and your family are in right now is not what you were hoping for and certainly not what you were expecting. And so all of those things can bring disappointment. It's totally normal to feel when your expectations are not being met for you to have a sense of disappointment. That's very normal. And with that emotion of disappointment comes lots of other emotions, right? Like you've experienced sadness maybe and a sense of loss over your expectations not being met. This disappointment has caused you to have a sadness, and maybe depression is a little strong, but maybe you've experienced that. It can also cause you to be angry or bitter or frustrated when things are not going the way that you want them to. That's very normal. Everybody experiences that. But here's what's interesting to think about as a Christian. Is as Christians, ultimately we believe that God is the one who's sovereign over all things. And if that's true, then it's not just life that is somehow disappointing. It's also God who feels disappointing sometimes. Have you ever felt like, God, okay, if you're in control and you're good and loving and powerful, then why are you not doing this? Or why have you not stopped doing that? Have you ever felt that way before? Have you ever felt like God didn't seem to be living up to your expectations and consequently God was disappointing? What are we supposed to do with that? What do we do when it feels like that God's not doing what a good God should do, and we're supposed to trust him, we're supposed to have faith in him? How do we think about our faith? How do we respond to God when he feels disappointing? That's what I want to talk about briefly this morning. The good news is that we are not the first people who have ever felt like that. And I think that there's a cool little exchange that Jesus has with John the Baptist in Luke chapter 7 that can help us think about this. What do we do when God is disappointing? What should we do with our faith when it seems like God's not doing what he should do? So John the Baptist is the one that Jesus talks with about this. And it's a really interesting story. John the Baptist, if you don't know who he is, Jesus describes him as the greatest man who's ever been born. Now, that is a compliment, especially coming from Jesus. And John the Baptist was Jesus's cousin. He was older than Jesus, and before Jesus hit the scene, John the Baptist was this largely popular figure. Lots of scholars outside of the biblical account wrote about him during his time. So we have a lot of stories about him that were circulating that we get from not only the Bible. So he was a significant figure. He created this huge following, and what he did with his followers is tell them, hey, I'm actually not that great. There's one coming after me that you really need to follow. And then when Jesus showed up on the scene, John the Baptist was like, yep, that's the one we've been talking about. Everybody needs to go follow Jesus. So from the very beginning of of Jesus' ministry, John the Baptist was the very first person in line to say, Jesus is the person you need to follow. Jesus is the person you need to believe in. Jesus is the person you need to trust. So John the Baptist is on the Jesus train. He's the very first one. In fact, he kind of gets the Jesus train rolling down the track. That's who John the Baptist is. But in this exchange that John the Baptist and Jesus have, John asks a really interesting question. And before we get to the question, you've got to know the events that lead up to John asking the question. So, Luke chapter 7, here's what happens. Jesus is in the city called Capernaum, which was a large fishing town, and there's a centurion there who works for the Roman government. He's a Roman soldier, and he has a servant who's sick, and he really cares about this servant, and he hears about Jesus, and so he thinks Jesus can do something for him. And so he goes and he asks Jesus to heal his servant, and Jesus is so impressed with his faith, and Jesus heals the man's servant because of his faith. It's a cool story. Then Jesus goes into this little obscure town called Nain, N-A-I-N, Nain. And Nain is the kind of city that sounds like it is, or it's the kind of city, its name is fitting. It's a small podunk town. Nobody's ever been there. But Jesus goes there. And while Jesus goes there, he sees this funeral taking place. And everybody's grieving because this woman has lost her son. She's a widow. And so in their culture, without men in her life now, nobody's going to be able to take care of her. And so everybody is just grieving the loss of this son. Jesus goes up and says, "Stop crying." And he raises her son from the dead. And people are just freaked out. And they're like, surely this is a prophet who has visited us today. And they start trembling and praising God, giving praise to God for what Jesus has done for this woman. And so everybody is amazed and worshiping, except John. John the Baptist hears about those stories, and it causes him to not worship and praise and have more faith in God, more faith in Jesus. But instead, it causes John to start doubting. And he has a question. And here's what he says in Luke chapter 7, verse 18. Then John's disciples told him about all these things, these healings that Jesus had done. So John summoned two of his disciples. He calls two disciples to himself, and he sent them to the Lord. He sends them to Jesus asking, here's John's question. Are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else? Are you the one who is to come, Jesus? Are you the Messiah, the one that the Old Testament prophesied about? Are you the one that our fathers, that our Jewish heritage has been telling us about would come? Are you the one who is to come, or should we be looking for someone else? Now, here's why this is such a weird and sad question coming from John. Because like we've said, John got the Jesus is the Messiah train on the track and moving down the track. So why is he doubting now? Why is he asking this question? And I think there's a couple of reasons. There's a personal reason, and then there's a theological reason. The personal reason is this. At this moment, when Jesus is out healing the centurion's servant and raising this man from the dead, John is in prison. He's been arrested by Herod, and he's going to be executed pretty soon. And I think that John is wrestling with the fact that, Jesus, if you are the Messiah, then why am I someone who I literally told people to follow you as the Messiah? I did the right thing, the humble thing. I sent all of this crowd that I built, I sent them to you. Why am I in here suffering? And you're out in Nain, of all places, healing randoms. And I'm your cousin, your friend, your closest follower, the first person in line, and here I am in prison. Jesus, why is that going on? So I think there's a personal reason that he's asking this. And And then I think there's also a theological reason. That just means there's something that he believed about God, about Jesus, and the way that God would work. There's something that he believed that was off, so that whenever he looked at Jesus, things weren't quite lining up. And the reason that's important is because we all have things that we think about God, things that we believe about God, that influence the way that we think God should work. And whenever we see God acting differently than we believe he should, or differently than we think he should, we tend to, just like John, be disappointed and doubt. Now, what was the theological reason? What was the belief that John had about God that was different than what Jesus was doing? Well, John thought that Jesus was the Messiah, which means in John's mind that he thought Jesus had come to establish God's reign on the earth, which means that he needs to overthrow the injustice of the world. He needs to overthrow the unjust governments of the world, like the Romans. And so rather than healing a Roman soldier's servant, maybe you should be defeating the Roman soldiers in John's mind. John thought that Jesus had come to not just establish God's reign, but also to free the Jewish people. And in John's mind, that looked like maybe a revolt, or maybe, who knows. And Jesus has come to do all of that stuff. But what John didn't know is that Jesus did not come to do all of that in his first coming to the earth. But instead, Jesus was going to have a second coming. In the first coming, Jesus came not to judge the world, but to save the world, to forgive the world. And after he did that, by dying on the cross and being raised from the dead and ascending to his Father, then someday he will return to the earth to stop injustice and overthrow all evil regimes and to fully establish God's kingdom on the earth. Jesus will do all of those things. John just didn't know it was going to happen in 2 Advents or 2 comings. And so he's rightfully so a little bit confused when he finds himself in prison and Jesus is doing all of these other things in random places. And so he sends his servants to ask Jesus, "Are you the one who is to come, or should we be looking for someone else?" And here's what happens next. Verse 20. When the men reached him, they said, "John the Baptist sent us to ask you, are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else?" Verse 21. At that time, Jesus healed many people of diseases, afflictions, and evil spirits, and he granted sight to many blind people. He replied to them. Here's what he says. "Go and report to John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, those with leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor are told the good news. And blessed is the one who is not offended by me." Now, in this little response, on the surface, it's like, I don't really get how that's comforting or helpful. But as we dive into it, we see that this is actually so powerful, what Jesus says here. What he's doing as he says, "Go and report to John that the blind receive their sight, the lame walk, those with leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the poor are told the good news." What he's doing is referencing these Old Testament passages that predict what the Messiah will do. So he's referencing the book of Isaiah, and he's saying, look, I'm doing what the Messiah is supposed to do. I'm doing what the prophets have said would be done. And then he says, "And blessed is the one who is not offended by me." So he's saying, look, I'm actually doing exactly what Scripture has said. And blessed is the one who is not offended by me. And what is he saying? he's saying this little promise at the end, blessed is the one who isn't offended by me. I think that it's hard for us to understand because the word blessed and offended are not necessarily words that we use on a regular basis. But here's what I think he's saying. The word offended here means to not fall away on account of, or to not stop associating with someone. That's what it means. So we might think about it like this. If you support some kind of cause or politician, and then they start to act in a way that you no longer respect or appreciate or agree with, then you might stop supporting them, either by no longer talking them up in public or by no longer giving them money. That would be you being offended by them. You would be stopping your support. So Jesus is saying that blessed, that means just happy. That means being joyful. Blessed is the one who is not offended by me. In other words, the one who sticks with me, the one who doesn't stop associating with me when they start seeing me do things that don't make sense to them, the one who will stick with me will be blessed. That is, they will be happy in the long run. In the end, they'll be glad that they stuck with me. That's what Jesus is saying. So here's why I think that Jesus' statement to John the Baptist is so helpful for us and so powerful. Jesus is teaching us two things. First, that whenever we begin to form our opinion about what kinds of things God should do, we have to base them on his promises. We have to shape our understanding of what God should do based on what God has said that he will do. We should not hold God accountable for things that God has not promised to do. Jesus has come to the earth and he's doing exactly what was prophesied about him. Now, John was a little confused because there were parts of the prophecy he didn't see being fulfilled. And so that's the second thing Jesus shows us is, wait, whenever it begins to look like God's not doing what you thought he would, don't disappear. Don't fall away. Don't be offended. Don't stop associating with him, but stick with him. Trust him. And in the end, you'll be glad that you did. So as I think about what this means for us as we continue to wrestle with COVID-19 and all that goes along with that, here's what I think we need to remember. We need to remember what God's promises actually are to us. He has not promised wealth and health and prosperity. In fact, he's promised us the opposite. He said that in this world we will have trouble, but that we can take heart because he has overcome the world. Someday he will return to the earth and he will make all things right. And that is what our hope is. That is what we are trusting. That if we stick with him, if we continue to trust him, if we do not fall away, that we will be blessed, that we will be happy, that we will be glad that we stuck with him. That is what he has promised. Here's what I think this looks like for us. I think it means that as we walk through difficult circumstances, that we need to remind ourselves of who God is in his word, of what he promises is true about him. He is a rock and fortress for our soul. He is our good shepherd. He is the one who overcomes the world. He is the one who is wise and that we can trust. He is the one who is strong and powerful that we can depend on. He is so many things in his word. But unless we are familiarizing ourselves with the promises of God in his word, we will be tempted to think that God should act as people like us think he should act. Instead, what we need to do is remind ourselves of the promises of God in his word. We need to remind ourselves of that, and then we need to align our expectations of God with who God is and what God has promised in His Word. And if we will do that, and if we will stick with Him in the midst of difficult trials, in the midst of difficult circumstances, if we'll stick with Him, we'll be glad that we did. Listen, I don't know exactly what you're walking through right now as a family or as a single person. I don't know what work looks like for you or finances or all of that. But here's what I know. That you have a God in the person of Jesus who has come to earth, stepped into difficult circumstances with you. He is able to sympathize with you in your weakness. He knows what it's like to walk where you walk. He stepped in with you so that He can lead you out. And He promises to do so. That may not look like what you're expecting, but someday, in His timing that is much wiser than our timing, someday in His timing, He will return to the earth to make all things right. So would you stick with Him? That's my prayer for you during these days.